So let me understand this, right? So I spent 2 nights on this channel being really concerned, and then finally United go and do something. Like, what do I do now? Do I move the goalpost and say I was never worried in the first place? We've seen the report, obviously. Ornstein's reporting that United are closing in on the deal for Carlos Baleba for around 65 million. And listen, all things considered, I'm excited. Um, I think partly because we've been absolutely starved of any business, but I actually do like Baleba. Um, but like, because I had my concerns. We're 3 days away. No, we're not. We're 2 days away now from the season starting, and it's been over a month since the Tielemans deal, and United just seemed to freeze. And I think the issue I had was the fact that when I watched this in pre-season, it started to expose some of the holes in the squad, not just in terms of quality, but in terms of like profiles as well. And then again, INEOS apparently decided to move in complete silence. Now, would I have liked them to move quicker? Yeah, absolutely, because we're cutting a ridiculously fine. But if we get this deal done, we've finally addressed an area where I think we desperately needed addressing. I think it was pretty obvious. And I think we've done it with probably one of the most most fascinating midfielders. I used the word fascinating there that we could have signed, because Carlos Baleba is an interesting one. He's probably one of the biggest like boom or bust midfield signings we could have made this summer. In the sense of when he's good, he's absolutely ridiculous, but like when he's bad, he can look really bad. And I think that's why I don't want the excitement around the transfer to suddenly turn into revisionism about this player, because he's not the perfect midfielder. Um, there were better marquee needle mover, gap closer, whatever buzzword you want to use about the midfield, right? In terms of like the high quality midfielders of like the likes of Anderson, Tchouameni, Bruno Guimaraes, these midfielders that were available. Baleba's not at that level, and there are legitimate concerns. His decision making for me can be inconsistent. His spatial awareness is questionable. There are moments where I feel like he needs to recognize when he should release the ball when he gets it rather than just carry it. And it feels like even when he does carry it, he doesn't do it with the same purpose like someone else would. And what I mean by that is when you watch Mainoo pick up the ball and carry it into midfield, you can see he's doing it with a purpose. You could just feel like he's going to carry it and then release it. Baleba feels like when he gets it, I don't really know how to explain it, but it's just like when you watch the two, you can see they carry it differently. It looks like Baleba's gone and he's like, right, what do I do here? Let me just run with the ball for a bit. And I think to an extent his physicality and his pace does get him out of jail with it sometimes. Sometimes he can lead himself into dangerous situations. And you know what? His technical execution isn't always as secure as maybe a lot of other midfielders we've been linked to or probably could have gotten instead. But like, I'm just going to put this out there now that I don't buy into this whole. I've seen people talk about Baleba like he's Ugarte a little bit technically, and I'm just like, I don't think he's that. I don't think he's that insecure with the ball, if you like. Like if I see Ugarte get the ball, I'm a bit worried what he's going to do with it. I don't get that with Baleba as such. And one thing I will say is the fact that I'm excited because Baleba's one of those midfielders as well where like you could argue he might be limited in some aspects, but I think the things that he's good at, he's exceptional at. And for me, I think he provides high value because of the fact that he's exceptional at things that we're desperately lacking. And this is where you've got to look at the midfield recruitment as building a unit as opposed to just collecting individually talented midfielders. We've already brought in Tielemans and Santos, right? And they're much more like pass first. They're more technicians. They've raised, like I said the other night, they've raised the technical floor of this midfield considerably. You've also got Kobbie Mainoo, who gives you like control, press resistance. He's great in tight spaces, and his carrying ability is good. And it's been quite obvious what we don't have, which is an absolute midfield athlete. And I do think that regardless of what kind of philosophy Michael Carrick wants to implement, I do think we need that. Someone who can eat ground, someone who can recover in defensive transitions, someone with genuine power. And for me, that is Baleba. And it's why the signing makes sense, because I thought even before the season started that we've needed an athlete in midfield and maybe another athlete at the back. But in terms of midfield, we did need a athlete because it was something we were lacking. And there are going to be times where our possession first, our technicians are going to be great in. A lot of games, probably there are going to be games in the Champions League probably that you can afford to have a midfield three of maybe Santos, Mainoo, and Bruno. But there are going to be games that where we could get ran through, and we're going to need that physicality in there. And what he does is he gives you that athleticism in midfield immediately. And I think as well, the fact that one thing I've always thought is when you do a midfield rebuild, you need everyone to be partnerable. And I think we've got one thing we haven't had in years is a range of partnerable midfield pivots, which we've got. Could you play Mainoo and Santos together? Yeah. Could you play Santos and Tielemans together? Yeah. Could you play Baleba with all the midfielders? Yeah, absolutely. What's that there? Just 5 partnerships on its own? It's not really something we've had. And like for me with the Baleba signing though, there is an important caveat, which is the fact that physicality can't come at the expense of footballing ability. And I think that with the squad building, we needed to get that right, because you can't just go all athletes, but then again, you can't just go all technicians and no physical ability, no physicality. I don't know what I'm talking about here. If I could create the perfect midfielder for this squad, obviously I'd want Baleba's athleticism, and then you got the technical consistency of the other midfielders, and obviously those players are rare. I think Alex Scott was kind of like a halfway point, maybe more athletic than Tielemans or Santos, but probably more technically sound than Baleba. And I'm just gonna put this out there: if we move on, I said the other night that I reckon we move on from Mountain Ugarte next summer, and we'll be back in the midfield market. And for me, Alex Scott is probably the one we sign if he hasn't moved by then. But with Baleba, he gives you an extreme, like the complete opposite end of the spectrum to Tielemans or Santos. And sometimes, for me, an extreme attribute can be incredibly valuable when the rest of your squad compensates for what that player doesn't do as well. And like I said, there's almost this idea with him that he's just some physical specimen who can't play football. I'm not going to sit here and say he's technically elite, but he's not technically useless either. He can strike from range, which I don't think is a fluke. He's comfortable enough using both feet. He doesn't. If he's receiving possession from a certain angle, he doesn't have that kind of. He needs to be have a certain angle, because you get that with some midfielders. I don't know if any of you who will watch this and I've noticed. You get some midfielders who can almost take the ball on certain angles and whatnot. He doesn't seem to have that when he receives the ball. He can carry inside, can carry outside, and when his carrying game gets going, it can be genuinely game breaking. That's why the previous season at Brighton was so exciting. There were games where he almost looked like a one-man midfield. He could win possession, eat up ground, and suddenly United or Brighton, in the anecdote, are 30 yards further up the pitch. And for me, that's a rare ability. My issue with Baleba with this is making that appear consistently, because last season was nowhere near the level of the season before. He was in and out of Brighton's team. His performances fluctuated massively. Maybe it was his head had been turned, concentration, tactical. Maybe it was just a young player who had a poor season. But whatever the explanation, United shouldn't ignore it. We shouldn't sit here and think, yes, we've got an amazing midfielder. Let's not think about the other parts because it would just be naive. And there is risk with it. But for me, at the price, I said the other night that I thought because we were the only ones at the table for him, we could get him for a lot cheaper than Brighton probably would have wanted for him and the other midfielders in the market. And at 65 million, considering when Brighton started off north of 100 previously, I can understand why United think this is the moment to take that risk. And for me, this is where having Michael Carrick is important because he shouldn't arrive at United and just become the entire midfield. And I think that's kind of the good thing about the options we're starting to build. You put him alongside Tielemans and you got someone who naturally wants to dictate and pass next to someone who wants to just carry it. Put him alongside Santos, and again, you've got a different balance. And I think the fact that we've got a variety, and that's not even mentioning Mainoo, but notwithstanding that, the fact that we can construct different midfield combinations based on opposition rather than asking the same two players to solve every problem, I think that might actually help Baleba because it means he doesn't necessarily have to start every week. The price tag might create that expectation externally, but I don't think Carrick should care. There will be games that will suit each of the midfielders, especially particularly when United need physicality and to be secure when in transition going the other way. There will be games that will scream for Baleba, and I think that's what squad building is supposed to look like. Different tools for different problems. And I think he becomes interesting when you think about the Champions League, because one thing that has concerned me right now about this United side is the defensive transition. When we turn over possession, there are moments where it feels like we don't have enough recovery, and I think he changes that. His ability to cover ground and just win tackles, it just means he can kind of he can find himself solving problems that the other midfielders physically can't get to. And I think European football can exaggerate those athletic advantages as well. Like when you're playing the bigger sides, for example, like PSG, for instance, there will be teams technically capable of playing around pressure. But I think for me, Baleba gives United somebody who's capable of recovering and turning what looks like a dangerous transition into our own attack. And for me, it's an enormous asset. And then on the side of that, there is the left back versatility. Because he's got the potential at left back in certain matches. Now, I'm not saying sign him and suddenly we don't need a left back. I'd still love it if we sign Lewis Hall, even Anthony Robinson. But if the club doesn't do that deal for whatever reason, Baleba gives you Carrick another option, especially in possession, because we've seen it at Arsenal when there were games where we've seen it when they've had Lewis Skelly in at left back. There were times where Xhaka would play left back. You've got Baleba starting from left back before moving centrally during build-up play, and because he's capable of receiving and carrying and physically covering massive spaces, there are interesting possibilities there. And that could allow United to get through the season with Luke Shaw, Dorgu, and occasionally Baleba there, without completely abandoning the pursuit of a long-term left back. Now, I don't want to wait till next summer because I feel like we do that every summer, maybe next year. And I think temporarily it kills two birds with one stone without pretending that second bird doesn't need killing eventually. I don't know where I'm going with that. But if INEOS suddenly find another 60 or 70 million pounds lying underneath the sofa and want to get Lewis Hall, yeah, by all means. I'm not going to suppress ambition. Go and get him. But I think what ultimately the transfer will come down to is the value. How good can he be? Because you're not paying 65 million purely for what he is right now. You're paying for what he could become. And I think the ceiling is enormous. The Baleba we saw 2 seasons ago looked like someone who could eventually become one of the most complete physical midfielders in the league. The Baleba we saw last season looked considerably more questionable. And the gamble is which one are United buying? but he's still young enough for Carrick and the coaching staff to refine him. And I think, unlike Brighton, United don't need him to be absolutely everything. We can construct midfield around his strengths. We've got enough midfielders who are technically cleaner and are more partnerable. And we can rotate him and we can use him in games that suit his profile. And with the value itself, people will be talking about, especially off the back of the last season, is he worth 65 million? As if there's like an objective objective universal answer. And I think for me, sometimes there isn't, because I think a player's value depends partly as well on what he provides to your team. And I think he's more valuable to us because his strongest attributes are precisely the attributes this squad lacks. Ball carrying, recovery speed, power, ground coverage, physical dominance, and defensive capability. We already have midfielders who can give us everything else. He gives us something different, and that's why I'm warming to the deal considerably. Like, it's not risk-free, don't get me wrong. But I think I mentioned boom or bust earlier. The boom is very exciting because if Carrick can develop and coach him with some decision making and consistency and can build a midfield around him that covers his deficiencies, you've potentially got an absolute monster. And we've seen that player in the Premier League already. And now United have to make sure that that version of Carlos Baleba becomes the norm rather than the exception. And I think after weeks of me feeling like I'm questioning where the athleticism is coming from, it looks like INEOS have finally answered that with Carlos Baleba for that kind of money. So that's my take on the Baleba deal. 65 million, I personally, in the current market, and I think is a good deal for him. It looks like it's happening, but yeah, let me know what you think of the deal. Do you think he's good business? Do you think he completes the midfield rebuild? And how valuable do you think he'll be for us? How high do you think his ceiling actually is? So yeah, thank you for tuning in. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the hype button if you can. And check out my other content. And I'll see you in the next one.